The early morning haze hung over the city, blanketing the streets in a quiet stillness. It was a day that would change everything for Nguyen Hue Minh, the deputy director of the Department of Public Works. Known for his meticulous work and unblemished career, Minh had never imagined his life could be disrupted so suddenly. Inside the anti-corruption unit, officers were hard at work, poring over mountains of documents and tips that had been coming in for weeks. The investigation was a complex one, involving high-ranking officials and suspected kickbacks across multiple sectors. It had been months since they began gathering intelligence, and the pieces were starting to fall into place. One name, however, kept cropping up in their investigation: Nguyen Hue Minh. The police, led by Detective Tan, were convinced they had found their man. His name matched those found in questionable financial transactions, and his position within the government seemed to put him right in the center of the alleged corruption network. They had no reason to doubt. The evidence seemed solid. An arrest warrant was issued. Later that morning, Minh arrived at his office as usual. He hadn't received a call or any indication that his name had come under suspicion. But as he entered the building, uniformed officers were waiting for him. "Mr. Nguyen Hue Minh," one officer said, "you are under arrest for suspected involvement in a corruption scheme. Please come with us." Minh was stunned. He hadn't heard the charges. Couldn't comprehend why he was being arrested. "There's been some mistake," he said, trying to steady his breath. "I don't know anything about this." But it didn't matter. The officers weren't interested in explanations. They took him to the precinct, handcuffed and confused, with no room for negotiation. Once inside the interrogation room, he was left alone for hours. His mind raced as he waited, trying to make sense of what was happening. He was a well-respected public servant. His career had been built on integrity and dedication. This couldn't be true. Eventually, Detective Tan walked in. The officer was cold and serious, his eyes scanning Minh's face as if looking for cracks in his story. "Mr. Minh, I suggest you cooperate fully. We have substantial evidence linking you to a network of corrupt officials. You're not the victim here. You're part of a system that has stolen from the people. Now tell us everything." Minh sat still, the weight of the accusation hanging heavily on him. "I swear I don't know anything about this," he said, his voice rising slightly in frustration. "There must be some mistake. I've worked for the public for years. I have nothing to do with any of this." Tan remained unmoved. Hours of questioning passed with little change in Minh's position. The more he denied the allegations, the more determined the detective seemed. They presented him with falsified documents and fabricated financial records, but Minh refused to yield. As the day wore on, the pressure began to take its toll. Minh felt the crushing weight of the system that was turning against him. His reputation, his life's work, was being dismantled with every passing moment. He had never been in trouble before, never had reason to question the integrity of his colleagues or the police. But now, he found himself trapped in a nightmare. The next morning, as Minh sat in a holding cell, he knew he had to fight. He couldn't let them destroy everything he had worked for. He requested a lawyer, someone who could help him navigate the mess he had been thrust into. Enter Lan, a sharp and determined lawyer known for taking on difficult cases. She immediately began reviewing the files, her eyes scanning every document, every piece of evidence that had been presented. The more she read, the clearer it became that there had been a grievous mistake. The financial records linked to Nguyen Hue Minh weren't his. They belonged to another official with the same name, but with a completely different identity. It was a case of mistaken identity, the result of a simple but tragic coincidence. Lan quickly presented the new evidence to the police, but the damage had already been done. The media had picked up the story. Headlines blared accusations of corruption against a high-ranking government official. Minh's name was now synonymous with scandal, and no matter how many times he insisted on his innocence, the public was already swayed by the charges. Days turned into weeks. Min's life, once stable and respected, now lay in tatters. He was released from custody, but the harm to his reputation was irreversible. The police issued a brief, half-hearted apology, but it wasn't enough. The trust had been broken. Min's dignity had been stripped away, and he was left with nothing but the truth and the legal fight that lay ahead. He and Lon decided to file a lawsuit. They were determined to hold the police accountable for the wrongful arrest, the public defamation, and the emotional distress caused by the entire ordeal. The case quickly gained national attention, with Min becoming the symbol of the dangers of unchecked police power and the failures of the justice system. In the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Min's legal team presented the evidence of the mistaken identity, the failures of the police to verify their information before making the arrest, and the damage done to Min's personal and professional life. The defense, led by the police, tried to argue that the arrest was justified based on the information they had at the time, but it was clear that they had rushed to conclusions without proper investigation. The public sentiment began to shift. People began to see Min as a victim, not a perpetrator. The legal battle became more than just about compensation. It became a fight for justice. For Min, it was about reclaiming his honor and ensuring that no one else would suffer the same fate. As the court proceedings continued, the police were forced to acknowledge their mistakes. They had been too hasty, too confident in their information, and had caused irreparable harm. But for Min, the road to redemption would be long and painful. The scars of the wrongful arrest would never fully heal. As Min's legal battle progressed, the courtroom became a battleground not just for his personal vindication, but for the integrity of the police department and the justice system itself. The case quickly spiraled beyond just a simple lawsuit into a full-blown public affair. Media outlets covered every detail of the proceedings, with some criticizing the police for their negligence, while others attempted to discredit Min, questioning his motives and framing him as a disgruntled public official seeking revenge. For Min, each day was an emotional roller coaster. Though he had been released from custody, the damage to his reputation persisted. Colleagues he had worked with for years now looked at him with suspicion, some even avoiding eye contact. The whispers in the hallways of the Department of Public Works grew louder, and Min couldn't escape the shame of being publicly branded a criminal. Even though he had been completely innocent, he stayed in his office longer hours than usual, hoping to avoid the stares of his colleagues, but also to focus on the legal papers and strategies that Lon, his lawyer, was drafting. He spent sleepless nights poring over witness statements and re-examining his movements on the day of his arrest. Despite his exhaustion, he was determined to see this through to the end. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Lon had gathered a formidable team of legal experts, each one focused on different aspects of the case. Her strategy was clear: expose the police's rashness, show how they failed to verify critical details, and highlight the profound consequences their actions had on Min's life. It wasn't just about compensation. It was about exposing the truth. Lon had her work cut out for her. The police defense was strong, and they were desperate to avoid the potential fallout that a ruling against them would bring. Lon, in court, addressing the judge: "Your Honor, we are not here today simply to seek damages from my client. What we are here to do is hold accountable those who, in their haste and negligence, have done more than just tarnish the reputation of an innocent man. They have robbed him of his dignity, his career, and his peace of mind." She pointed to the defense table where the police representative sat today. This is not just a matter of a case gone wrong. It is a warning to every public servant, to every citizen, that when law enforcement operates in a vacuum, unchecked and rushed, it is the innocent who suffer. The defense attorney stood up, visibly annoyed. "Defense attorney, Your Honor, while we understand the distress that Mr. Nguyen has experienced, we must emphasize that the arrest was made based on the information available at the time. It was a mistake, but it was a mistake made in good faith, based on credible evidence. Lon, you call it a mistake, but it's a mistake that cost my client everything. It's a mistake that, under the law, should never have happened. We have shown through this trial that basic steps of verification were ignored, that the most critical facts were overlooked. And what do we get? A few words of apology and a ruined life. The public opinion of men began to shift. As more people learned about the details of the case, many began to rally behind him. Activists and public figures spoke out, demanding accountability from the police. A hashtag emerged, #JusticeForMen, which quickly gained traction across social media platforms, sparking debates and spreading awareness about the dangers of systemic failures within law enforcement. Despite the mounting public support, the stress of the trial began to take its toll on men. He struggled with sleepless nights, haunted by memories of his time in jail. The cold concrete, the stark fluorescent lights, the feeling of helplessness. But even more than that, he grappled with the damage to his reputation. How would he ever move forward after this? Could he ever regain the trust of the people who had once admired him? His family, too, felt the strain. His wife, once a pillar of strength, began to show signs of fatigue, her own mind clouded with worry. Their children, once proud of their father's work, were now subjected to the harsh whispers and stares of classmates and teachers who had heard the rumors. Min's personal life had been shattered almost as badly as his professional life. Yet, despite all this, Min knew that he couldn't give up now. Not after everything he had been through. Lon remained a steady presence by his side. She had become more than just his lawyer. She was his ally, his voice in a system that had for too long treated them as if they were invisible. The legal battles were long, and the court sessions often stretched into late afternoons. But she never lost faith in their cause. One afternoon, during a particularly grueling cross-examination, the defense attorney made an unexpected move. He pulled out a new piece of evidence, an email thread that had been hidden until then. The email seemed to suggest that the police had known about the mistaken identity, but had ignored it in favor of making an arrest quickly, wanting to close the case. It was a bombshell. The emails painted a picture of negligence, of an institution more focused on appearances than the truth. Lon leaned over to Min, her face grim but determined. "Lon, this is a smoking gun. We've got them now." But even with this new development, the police weren't ready to back down. They fought back harder, questioning the authenticity of the emails and accusing Lon of fabricating evidence. The trial became more heated, and Min found himself caught in a whirlwind of accusations and counterclaims. With the evidence now firmly on the table, the judge was forced to adjourn the trial, promising to make a ruling soon. The days before the decision weighed heavily on Min. His life felt like it was in limbo, caught between a past that had been destroyed and a future that seemed uncertain. As Min walked out of the courthouse that day, Lon by his side, he knew that the battle wasn't over. No matter the outcome, the scars of this ordeal would remain with him for the rest of his life. But there was something else, something more important he could still feel. It was hope that in the silence of the night. Min reflected on what lay ahead. This was a fight for his name, for justice, and for the very principles that had once guided him in his career. No matter the verdict, the message had been sent. Wrongful arrest would not be tolerated, and the truth, however difficult, would always find its way to the surface. The trial continued, and the atmosphere in the courtroom grew increasingly tense. Each side was digging in deeper, determined to have the last word. Min, though exhausted from weeks of emotional and legal battles, felt the weight of the situation more than ever. His reputation, his career, and his life had all been placed under a microscope, and the magnifying glass was relentless. It had become clear that this was no longer just about his wrongful arrest. It was about the systemic failures within law enforcement, about the ease with which innocent people could be crushed under the weight of false accusations. Lon had been working tirelessly, gathering witnesses and expert opinions. She had spent long nights drafting her arguments, tirelessly making calls to ensure everything was in order. But no matter how much they did, no matter how much evidence they presented, there was always a shadow of doubt cast over their case by the defense. Defense attorney. Ladies and gentlemen of the court, While we acknowledge that a mistake was made, we must emphasize that mistakes happen. It is unfortunate, but it does not negate the fact that Mr. Min's arrest was based on the best information available at the time. We are dealing with a complex case, and sometimes, even the most experienced officers make an error in judgment. Lan's voice rang clear in response, each word carrying the weight of Min's struggle, of the deep injustice he had endured. Lan, Your Honor, with all due respect, a mistake is one thing, but a mistake that ruins a man's life, his career, and his reputation is another. The police acted without the due diligence they were supposed to exercise. And not only that, they did so without remorse. When they learned of their error, they did not act swiftly to correct it. Instead, they let the narrative continue, damaging my client's name at every turn. Min sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him, his mind racing through every detail of the case. It wasn't just about the police's mistake anymore. It was about the lies that had been built around him. The newspapers had been quick to publish his name, quick to associate him with corruption, even though there was no proof. The whispers in the halls of his office had never stopped. His colleagues had distanced themselves from him, many acting as though his very presence was a stain on their own reputations. He hadn't been able to speak to his children properly in weeks. His son, once so proud of his father's work, now barely acknowledged him. His daughter, too young to understand the complexities of the situation, had begun to ask questions. Questions Min didn't know how to answer. He had always been a man of honor, someone who followed the rules. But now, in the face of this monstrous misunderstanding, he felt as though his entire world was being dismantled, piece by piece. Meanwhile, in the courtroom, Detective Tan and the officers who had arrested Min sat quietly, trying their best to maintain composure. They knew the gravity of the situation, but also knew that admitting to their mistakes would likely lead to severe repercussions for them, both professionally and personally. Tan, who had once believed his actions were justified, was now second-guessing everything. He knew that Min's arrest had been a mistake, but his pride made it difficult to admit that. He couldn't afford to lose face, not after everything he had put into this case. As the trial continued, a new twist emerged. Lan had uncovered more details about the police's haste in making the arrest. There were discrepancies in their investigation. Missing documents, unverified sources, and a rush to close the case quickly. It became evident that the police had failed to follow their own procedures, opting for a quick solution instead of a thorough investigation. And it wasn't just Min who had been wronged. The system had failed, and the integrity of the entire case was now being called into question. Lan hammered this point home during cross-examinations, showing how the police had ignored crucial details that could have exonerated Min much earlier. Lan, we now know that the police had been warned about this mix-up. There were clear indications from the very start that Mr. Min was not the right person. But rather than investigate further, they rushed ahead with the arrest, acting out of convenience, not justice. And what did that lead to? The destruction of an innocent man's life. As the days wore on, the trial began to take its toll on everyone involved. Min had lost his sense of normalcy, his sense of peace. The once orderly, controlled life he had led was now a distant memory. His interactions with his colleagues had become strained, and his family was worried about the toll the case was taking on his mental and physical health. Yet through it all, he refused to give up. This fight was not just for him, it was for justice. Lan, too, had her moments of doubt. The pressure was mounting, and the weight of the public's expectations rested heavily on her shoulders. The media continued to cover the trial, sometimes casting doubts on her abilities, but she refused to back down. She had seen the injustice Min had suffered, and she wasn't about to let the police get away with it. She often stayed late into the night, reviewing documents and working through strategies. Min would visit her office after hours, offering his support, his presence a reminder of what they were fighting for. Despite the stress, the fatigue, and the overwhelming pressure, Lan and Min's bond had only strengthened. They were not just lawyer and client. They were two people bound together by a shared mission to see the truth exposed and the wrong righted. The defense had started to show cracks, and it seemed that Min's side was gaining momentum. The police, once so sure of their case, were now backpedaling, attempting to cover their tracks. But their attempts to obfuscate the truth only seemed to make things worse. The public's view of Min had begun to shift even further in his favor. The courtroom had become a public forum, and every new revelation painted the police in a darker light. Min still hadn't fully processed the events of his arrest, the cruelty of the interrogation, the public humiliation he had suffered. But as the trial continued, he found himself focusing more on the principle of it all. He had to prove that an innocent person's life should never be so easily destroyed. His name, his honor, and his career were all on the line. But more than that, he knew he had to fight for the truth. Lan's strategy was clear, and she knew that with the newly uncovered evidence, they had a strong case. But the defense wasn't done yet. They would not simply let this case slip away. They had one final weapon up their sleeve, something that could change the course of the trial. The courtroom was filled with tension as the defense lawyers stood, ready to present their final argument. All eyes were on him, and Min held his breath. He knew that whatever happened next would change everything. As the defense prepared for their final argument, the air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Min sat in his chair, his hands folded tightly in his lap, trying to calm his nerves. The legal drama had gone on for weeks, but this was the moment they had all been waiting for. The closing statements, the last opportunity to shape the narrative before the judge made a decision. Lon, ever the calm and collected strategist, had remained a rock throughout the entire process. She had been by Min's side from the moment he had been wrongfully arrested, and her resolve had only strengthened as the case progressed. She knew this was the final hurdle. Win or lose, everything hinged on how they presented themselves now. Defense attorney, rising, his voice steady. Your Honor, esteemed members of the jury, while we understand the gravity of the situation and the distress caused by Mr. Min's arrest, we urge you to consider that this was, at its core, a mistake. A mistake made by officers acting in good faith, based on the evidence available to them at the time. To hold the police department accountable for this mistake would be to undermine the very system that ensures justice for all. We ask that you take this into consideration before rendering a judgment. Min's heart pounded in his chest. The words were carefully chosen, but there was no denying the weight of the argument. The defense was trying to diminish the impact of the mistake, presenting it as an unfortunate but inevitable event in the course of justice. Min knew this was their final effort to escape full responsibility for their actions. But to him, the truth was clear. The police had acted recklessly, ignoring crucial details, and now they were trying to make it seem like nothing more than a harmless error. He couldn't let that happen. He had to prove that this wasn't just about him. It was about the systemic flaws that allowed his life to be destroyed in the first place. Lon, rising to address the judge and jury. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we do not stand here today to simply seek compensation from my client, Mr. Min. We are here to demand accountability for a mistake that has had far-reaching consequences. The police acted in haste. They acted without care, and they acted without ensuring the basic checks and balances that should be inherent in any investigation. She paused, her eyes sweeping across the courtroom, making sure to engage each person in the room. The public galleries were filled with observers, reporters scribbling furiously, and activists who had rallied behind Min's cause. Mr. Min's life was shattered. His reputation, his family, his career, all of it was destroyed in the blink of an eye. And for what? Because a mistake was made. A mistake that could have easily been avoided if only the police had exercised the diligence required by their oath to serve and protect. What we are asking for today is not just compensation, but for the police to be held accountable for their negligence and for the systemic failure that allowed this to happen. Her voice grew stronger with each word, the passion in her statement resonating with the jury. This is about more than a case of mistaken identity. This is about ensuring that no one else has to suffer as Mr. Min has. This is about demanding that those who wield power must do so responsibly, The defense attorney rose again, his expression a mix of frustration and determination. Defense attorney, Your Honor, the plaintiff's counsel seems intent on portraying the police as nothing but villains. But let's not lose sight of the fact that mistakes are part of human nature. We are all fallible. The police acted within the scope of their authority, and while the result may have been unfortunate, it does not warrant the level of punishment being sought here. We respectfully request that you consider the broader picture, the pressure the police face, the complexity of the situation, and the difficulty of working under such circumstances. Min could feel the frustration building inside him. The defense had spent so much time trying to downplay what had happened to him, trying to justify the police's actions, that it felt like they were attempting to erase the pain he had endured. It wasn't just about the arrest. It was about what came after, the confinement, the humiliation, the public scorn. He had lost everything, and they were pretending as if it was nothing more than a minor slip-up. Lon, too, could see the defense's tactics and recognize that they were trying to paint the incident as an accident, something that should be shrugged off. But this was not something that could be brushed under the rug. Min's life had been destroyed, and the law had to hold the responsible parties accountable. As the closing statements ended, the jury was sent to deliberate. The courtroom emptied out, and Min, along with his lawyer, was left in the quiet aftermath of the intense day. The wait for the jury's decision was unbearable. Min felt like he was back in that interrogation room, waiting for the next moment that would change his life forever. The press had gathered outside, eager for any statements, any details they could get their hands on. Min hadn't spoken publicly throughout the entire trial, choosing instead to rely on Lon and his legal team to present the case. But now, he stood on the steps of the courthouse, facing the crowd of reporters who had been covering the story for weeks. Reporter 1, Mr. Min, how do you feel after today's proceedings? Min, I'm not here to talk about how I feel. I'm here to see justice done. It's been a long road, but I hope that in the end, the truth will prevail. In the coming days, the public attention continued to grow. Min had become a symbol of what could go wrong when those in power failed to follow the rules. Activists and citizens rallied behind him, demanding transparency, accountability, and reform. Min had been caught in a system that had failed him, but in the process, he had sparked something much larger, a conversation about the importance of due process, of ensuring that mistakes like his never happened again. The trial itself continued to capture the media's attention. Every day, reporters followed every twist and turn, analyzing every new development. Min had become a figurehead, a representation of a larger issue. As the days wore on, the weight of it all began to sink in. Lon was still working tirelessly behind the scenes. She had become a trusted voice for Min, someone who had helped him not just in the courtroom, but in navigating the complexities of his personal life during the trial. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she remained determined to see this through, no matter the outcome. But the pressure was mounting. The longer the case dragged on, the more Min began to wonder about the future. If the jury ruled in his favor, would that be enough to repair the damage that had been done? If they didn't, would he ever get the justice he deserved? The tension in the courtroom had only escalated since the closing statements. Min sat at the defendant's table, his mind racing as he tried to steady his breath. This was the moment everything had been leading up to. His life, his reputation, and the future of his career hung in the balance. Lon sat beside him, her demeanor calm yet determined. She had not once wavered during this entire ordeal, but even she could feel the weight of what was to come. Outside the courthouse, the media frenzy had reached new heights. The case had gained national attention, and every outlet seemed to have something new to say about the wrongful arrest of Fo Jiam Dokmin. Some took sides, others speculated wildly, but all of them agreed on one thing. This was a case that would have ramifications far beyond Min's personal story. It spoke to the broader issues of systemic corruption, police incompetence, and the fragile nature of one's reputation when put under the spotlight of a public scandal. Inside the courtroom, the jury deliberates. The judge called for a recess, and the jury was led away to deliberate. Min's body was stiff, but his mind felt like a whirlwind. He couldn't focus, couldn't keep still. His thoughts drifted to the day he was arrested, the handcuffs, the cold interrogation room, the insults thrown at him. He was just a name on a piece of paper to them, an object of suspicion to be dealt with, until it was too late. Despite the weight of the case on his shoulders, Min had to remind himself that this was more than just personal revenge. The larger issue at hand was the culture within the system. The police had acted rashly, failing to follow basic investigative protocols. It wasn't just his life they had put at risk. It was a reflection of a larger problem that needed to be addressed. No one should be subjected to this kind of treatment, no matter their position or their name. Lon, who had been quietly observing the trial's developments, knew that their chances were strong. They had presented their case well. Too well, in fact, for the defense to truly deny the police's mistakes. But there was always the fear of a miscarriage of justice. If the jury wasn't convinced that the police had acted maliciously, if they saw it as just a case of unfortunate miscommunication, then Min would walk away empty-handed. That thought alone made her stomach churn. She turned to Min, sensing his unrest. "Lon," whispering, "we've done everything we can. Now, all we can do is trust in the process. The evidence is on our side. We can't control what happens next, but you've been strong throughout. No matter what, we've made them listen." Min nodded, but the anxiety gnawed at him. The police had tried to claim their innocence by calling it a mere clerical error. Yet the more they pushed that narrative, the more it sounded like an attempt to cover up the truth. The police had acted quickly and recklessly, and it had nearly destroyed him. But would the jury see it the same way? The jury returns. Hours passed like days. Min and Lon sat through what felt like an eternity before the judge called the court back to order. The jury was returning. Min's heart raced, each step echoing in his mind as they walked back into the courtroom. It was a simple action, the return of a group of people who had spent hours deliberating on his fate. But to Min, it felt like the entire world was about to be decided in the next few minutes. The judge called the jury's foreperson to deliver their verdict. Min felt his throat dry as he listened intently, barely able to breathe. Jury foreperson, clearing throat. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Min. The arrest was not only unjust, but also unlawful due to the negligence and lack of proper investigation by the police. The damages to Mr. Min's reputation are substantial, and we find the police department responsible for the distress caused by their actions." A gasp swept through the courtroom. Min sat frozen for a moment, unable to fully process what he had just heard. His lawyer, Lon, barely reacted, but her eyes betrayed the relief she felt. Min could see her stiffen slightly, a faint but noticeable sign that they had won, that they had proven their case. But the victory was bittersweet. Jury foreperson, we also find that the police department must pay Mr. Min the appropriate compensation for his distress and damage to his reputation. The judge banged his gavel, and the room was filled with murmurs of shock and disbelief. Min, in a daze, stood slowly. He had won, but there was no joy in it, not yet. All he could feel was the strange, hollow emptiness of a man who had survived a storm, but hadn't yet come to terms with the wreckage it had left in its wake. Outside the courtroom, once the trial ended, Min and Lon were surrounded by reporters, all clamoring for a statement. This had been the story of the year, and the public wanted answers. Reporter 1, "Mr. Min, now that the jury has sided with you, how do you feel about the outcome?" Min, pausing to think, "I don't know if victory is the right word. The damage has already been done. But today, the court has ruled that justice was denied to me, and I'm here to say that justice matters. This case isn't just about me. It's about the way the system has to be accountable. No one, no matter their name or position, should be treated the way I was." His voice trembled as he spoke, but he stood tall, his posture straight. Despite the weight of it all, he had won a legal battle, but the personal consequences remained. Lon, ever the professional, stood by him but kept her focus on the next step, the damages. The trial was over, But the police still had to pay the price for their actions. She knew that this was just the beginning. There would be appeals, motions, and legal wrangling to come. But at least for now, they had made a statement. Lon, we've won this round, men. Now we take the next step. We'll get the compensation and ensure that this doesn't happen again. The aftermath, the days following the trial felt like a blur. The media storm surrounding the case only grew louder, with pundits debating the implications of the verdict. Min was a hero to some, a victim of systemic abuse to others. But no matter how the public viewed him, he knew the battle wasn't truly over. The true cost of his ordeal was still unfolding. He'd been vindicated in court, but his name still carried the stain of suspicion. His colleagues remained distant, and his family still had to process what had happened. And then there was the matter of the police. The department's reputation was tarnished, but Min knew the system would likely try to bury the incident. They couldn't afford to let it be seen as a failure on their part, especially with the potential fallout of this ruling. But Min couldn't afford to be distracted by the fallout anymore. His life had been put to the grinder, and now he had to find a way to rebuild it. He couldn't let the shadow of what had happened define him, even if the scars would always remain. He had to move forward, one step at a time. But with the legal victory came a new sense of responsibility. Min knew that he wasn't just fighting for his own dignity anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been wronged by a system that was supposed to protect them. This case wasn't just a personal battle. It was part of something larger, a fight for justice, for truth, for reform. And Min was just beginning to understand the full scope of that fight. Min's office, back in his office at the government department, Min tried to focus on the paperwork in front of him, but it felt like his mind was miles away. His colleagues, who had been sympathetic during his arrest, were now distant. Their words of support had slowly turned into awkward silences. Min wasn't sure whether it was the scandal or just the fact that no one knew how to deal with the fallout from what had happened. His presence in the office felt like an intrusion, as if everyone was too aware of the weight of the public's attention. Min, sitting at his desk, staring at the documents in front of him, muttering to himself, "How do I even begin again? How can I rebuild from this?" He hadn't expected it to be easy. No one who had been through what he had could come out of it unscathed. But the realization that things might never be the same again hit him harder than any public condemnation or media scrutiny ever had. His life felt like it was divided into two as now. The man before the arrest and the man after, at the police headquarters. Meanwhile, across the city, the police department was quietly trying to minimize the fallout from the trial. They had issued a public apology, but it felt hollow. They had acknowledged a mistake, but the public seemed to have a different expectation. Apologies were just words. What mattered now was action. Captain Dewey, the head of the investigation unit that had originally arrested Min, sat in his office staring at the press coverage of the case. He hadn't anticipated that things would unfold like this. What was supposed to be a simple case of mistaken identity had spiraled into a full-blown scandal. His department was under fire, and it wasn't just the wrongful arrest that people were angry about. It was the way the police had handled the entire situation afterward. Captain Dewey, speaking to his lieutenant, "We're going to have to do more than issue a statement. The damage to our reputation is deeper than we thought. The public doesn't just want apologies. They want accountability." The lieutenant nodded. Flipping through the stack of reports in front of him, they had already implemented new measures to avoid a repeat of the mistake. But those measures would mean little if the public didn't trust them again. The press conference. To address the growing controversy, the police department called a press conference. Captain Dewey stood in front of the podium, flanked by other senior officials. The cameras clicked, the flashbulbs went off, and reporters crowded around, each one eager for their question to be the one that revealed something new, something scandalous. Reporter 1, Captain Dewey, after the court's ruling, "Do you believe the police force has learned from its mistakes?" Captain Dewey, pausing before responding, "Yes, the department has learned a hard lesson. We are committed to ensuring that an error like this never happens again." Our officers are being retrained, and we are implementing a thorough review of our investigative protocols. Mistakes happen, but it's how we respond that counts. Reporter 2, are you considering any disciplinary actions against the officers involved? Captain Dewey, that's an internal matter, and we are handling it accordingly. We will be looking into the details of the investigation and the decision-making processes to understand where things went wrong. The room was filled with more questions, but Captain Dewey stuck to the talking points. The answers were carefully crafted, designed to protect the department while acknowledging the issue. But men knew that this wouldn't be enough. The public wasn't just angry about the arrest. They were angry about the cover-up, the refusal to admit fault, and the continued lack of transparency. Men and Lon meet again. Several weeks later, men sat across from Lon in the small cafe where they had met countless times before the trial. The tension that had once defined their relationship, strained by the pressures of the case, had finally given way to a quiet, unspoken understanding. Men, looking up at her, I thought winning would be the hardest part, but now I feel like it's just the beginning. I can't go back to the way things were. I don't think I ever will. Lon, nodding thoughtfully, you're right. Things will never be the same. But that doesn't mean you can't rebuild. You have the truth on your side now, Min. And you have the support of a lot of people who've seen what's really happened. It won't be easy, but you have the strength to keep going. Min, sighing, it's hard to see how, though. Every time I walk into that office, it's like I can feel the whispers. I can see the glances. It's like I'm a ghost walking through the halls, trying to hold on to something that's already slipped away. Lon, you're not a ghost. You're someone who's fought for justice. That's something most people don't ever get to do. You've already won something bigger than any court decision. But now, you have to focus on your next steps. You have to show them what you're capable of beyond all of this. Min stared at her for a moment, processing her words. She was right, of course. The case had forced him to confront the worst of what could happen to someone in his position, but it had also opened his eyes to the possibilities of change. He had become a symbol, not just of corruption and injustice, but of resilience. It was now up to him to make sure that his story didn't end here. A new chapter. In the weeks that followed, Min began to find his footing again. He met with journalists to discuss his case, giving interviews about the importance of accountability within the justice system. He used his newfound platform to advocate for reforms, not just in the police force, but in the way the government handled cases of wrongful arrest. He started to get involved in charity work and began consulting with lawyers and advocates to push for stronger protections for individuals who found themselves in situations like his. It wasn't easy. The road to recovery was long and filled with obstacles. Min knew that the scars of his wrongful arrest would never fully heal. But he also knew that he had the power to change the conversation, to reshape the narrative of his life. The world had seen him as a victim, but now he could choose how to be remembered, and though the scars would remain, they no longer defined him. Min's new initiative, one of the first major steps he took toward healing, was founding a non-profit organization aimed at advocating for victims of wrongful arrests and miscarriages of justice. The goal was not just to provide financial support to those in similar situations, but also to offer legal aid, psychological counseling, and public advocacy. Men understood firsthand the long-term damage caused by false accusations. It wasn't just the immediate suffering. It was the way society treated someone who had been publicly labeled a criminal, even if they were innocent. He put together a small but passionate team of like-minded professionals. Lawyers, social workers, former police officers, and victims who had been through similar ordeals. They all shared one common goal: to prevent others from going through what Min had endured. Min, despite the deep personal pain, poured his energy into the foundation, making it his new mission. Min, addressing his team in the conference room. Every day we hear stories of people who have been wrongfully accused and left to suffer in silence. This organization is about making sure their voices are heard. We have the opportunity to help those who don't have the resources to fight back. We can make a real difference. The press continues to lurk. The press, though less aggressive, still sought him out. Some outlets painted him as a martyr for the cause of justice, others as someone with an axe to grind against the police. Men had learned to handle the reporters, but it wasn't easy. He had become a symbol of something much larger than himself, something that required careful navigation. The media would always be a part of his life now, whether he liked it or not. One afternoon, Min received a call from a well-known journalist who had followed his case closely. Journalist, on the phone, "Mr. Min, we'd like to interview you for a special segment on police reform. Given your experience, we believe your perspective would resonate with a wide audience." Min, "I appreciate the opportunity, but I'm not sure if now's the right time. I'm focused on my foundation and the work we're doing for victims. This is bigger than me now." Journalist, "I understand, but your story could do a lot of good, Mr. Min. People need to hear from you." Min paused for a long moment. The journalist was right. His story had the power to influence, to change the narrative. Min, "I'll think about it. Let me get back to you." He had to admit that the opportunity was a good one. If he wanted to continue to make a difference, his voice had to remain loud. And maybe, just maybe, his experience could help others who were still too afraid to speak out. The police department's response. Back at the police headquarters, Captain Dewey and his team were still dealing with the fallout. Public opinion was divided. Some lauded their transparency, while others felt that they were simply trying to save face. The case had exposed a deep flaw in their investigation process, one that could not be easily swept under the rug. The department had already reformed some of its internal procedures in the wake of the scandal. Officers were undergoing additional training in investigative protocols, and a new oversight committee was created to ensure greater accountability. Yet, despite these changes, the damage had been done. Many members of the public were still skeptical of the police's willingness to change. Captain Dewey knew that the case wasn't going to disappear. The spotlight had shined brightly on the mistakes made by his officers, and while the department was trying to move forward, the truth was that the trust of the people had been severely damaged. Captain Dewey, to his lieutenant, in a rare moment of frustration, "We're doing everything we can to fix this, but it's not enough. The public doesn't trust us anymore. How do we rebuild that? How do we make them believe we can be trusted again?" His lieutenant didn't have a clear answer. They had made significant strides, but repairing the damage to their reputation would take time. Perhaps more time than they had. Rebuilding the reputation. Meanwhile, Min's organization began gaining momentum. He traveled around the country, giving speeches, meeting with local activists, and lobbying for stronger protections for those wrongfully accused. His foundation had attracted attention from both the public and private sectors, and donors were starting to come forward with financial support. Min was becoming a well-known advocate for justice reform, and his influence was growing. Despite all of this, Min still couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He had done so much to rebuild his life and his reputation, yet there was always this nagging question in the back of his mind. What now? Was this enough? One afternoon, Lon joined him in his office, the same room where they had celebrated their small victories during the trial. "Lon, how are you holding up?" Min, "I'm fine, but it's not about me anymore, is it? I've worked hard to turn this into something positive. But every day I wake up, I wonder if I'm doing enough. What if it's not enough? What if I'm still just chasing after something that will never be fully fixed?" Lon, "You're doing everything you can, Min. No one can expect you to solve the world's problems overnight. But you've given people hope. You've changed the conversation, and you've proven that one person can make a difference. That's all anyone can ask for." Min looked at her, appreciating the sentiment, but the weight of it all was still there. He had found his purpose in advocacy, but the personal cost of his ordeal remained with him every day. The emotional toll, the toll on his family, and the toll on his psyche. It was a burden he carried with no easy way to lay it down. A new challenge. But the story was far from over. Min had become a symbol of reform, But there were still powerful forces that wanted to silence his message. His growing influence had not gone unnoticed by certain individuals in power. In the midst of his newfound work, Min received an anonymous letter one day, postmarked from an unknown source. Letter: "We've been watching you, Min. The things you've been saying about police corruption and justice reform are dangerous. You may have won in court, but you will not be allowed to continue with your campaign for change. Take a step back, or we will make sure that your foundation will be nothing but a memory." Min stared at the letter for several moments, his hands shaking slightly. It wasn't a direct threat, but the message was clear. Someone was watching him, and they didn't want him to continue. Lon walked into the room just as Min set the letter down on his desk. "Lon, is everything all right?" "Min, it's fine, but this changes things." What Min had thought was just a personal battle was beginning to reveal itself as something much larger. Something that would require him to confront not only the wrongs of his past, but also the forces that wanted to suppress the future he was fighting to build. A meeting with unlikely allies. In an effort to better understand who might be targeting him, Min arranged a discreet meeting with a group of former insiders, individuals who had once worked for the police department or within the government, but who had since left, either disillusioned or disgraced. Min needed information, and he needed it fast. The meeting took place in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Min's nerves were on edge as he entered the dimly lit space. He could feel the weight of every step echoing off the concrete walls. Min, nervously glancing around. "Are they here?" Ex-police officer Mr. Hong, stepping out from the shadows. "They're here. Just stay calm. If you want to know who's been threatening you, this is the place." Min had heard rumors about people who had left the force and now operated outside of it, helping those who wanted to expose corruption, but trusting them, especially in a world as dangerous as the one he was stepping into, was another matter. As Min looked around the dim room, he saw a handful of individuals who seemed to be watching him intently, sizing him up. Most had the tired eyes of people who had been betrayed by the system they once served. Some were former officers. Others had worked in government agencies, and a few even had connections to organized crime. They were an unlikely alliance, but one that Min had come to trust. Min, trying to steady his voice, "I need to know who is behind the threats against me, who is trying to stop this movement." Mr. Hong stepped closer and handed Min a manila folder, the edges worn with age. Min opened it, scanning the documents inside. Photos of high-ranking officials, police officers, and business people were pinned to the pages, their connections laid out like a spider's web. "Mr. Hong, it's not just the police. It's the money. The corruption goes all the way to the top. Businesses with political connections, people who profit from the broken system. The system you're threatening with your foundation." Min, his hand trembling slightly as he examined the evidence. "I had no idea it went this far." The web of corruption was deeper and more extensive than Min had ever imagined. The individuals who stood to lose the most from his advocacy weren't just the corrupt officers or officials who had wronged him. They were powerful elites who had controlled the system for decades. And now, they saw Min as the greatest threat to their control. Ex-police officer Mr. Hong, nodding grimly. "They've already begun to silence anyone who speaks out. You're just the latest target. And if you don't stop pushing, they'll come after your foundation next. They have the means, the power, and the connections." Min sat back, the weight of the situation crushing down on him. He had thought his fight was about justice, about proving his innocence. But now, it was clear that this was a much bigger battle, a battle for the soul of the system itself. Min, with resolve building in his voice, "I won't back down. I didn't come this far just to stop because of threats. This isn't just about me anymore. This is about everyone who's been wronged by a system that's supposed to protect them. I have to continue." Mr. Hong looked at him, a mixture of admiration and concern in his eyes. "Mr. Hong, then you'll need allies. You can't do this alone." Min nodded. He knew that his fight had just taken on an even greater urgency. It wasn't just about rebuilding his own life. It was about toppling an entire system of corruption. But he had never been more certain of his path. The more he learned about those who were behind the corruption, the clearer it became that the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. The growing threat. That night, Min couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in bed, his mind racing with thoughts of the people he had just met, the evidence they had shown him, and the gravity of the situation he had found himself in. He tried to convince himself that he could handle this. He could outsmart the people behind these threats, just as he had outsmarted them in the courtroom. But this felt different. This was no longer just about proving a point. This was a battle for his life. At the same time, his phone buzzed. It was an encrypted message, one of the few he had received since the threats had begun. He opened it, heart pounding. The message was brief, but chilling. Message: we know who you are. If you continue with your foundation, you'll regret it. Your next move will be your last. Min stared at the message, his pulse quickening. They had been watching him closely. Unseen forces. The next morning, Min's foundation was hit with a financial audit. It was an unexpected blow. Officials arrived unannounced, demanding access to all financial records. They claimed that the foundation's funds were being misused, and it seemed like a blatant attempt to shut them down. Min knew this wasn't a coincidence. Whoever was behind this knew exactly how to hit him where it hurt the most: his reputation. Min, speaking with his lawyer Nguyen, they're using the system against us. They've made it look like we're doing something wrong, but we're not. Everything is above board. Nguyen, looking through the audit report, it's a smear campaign. They want to discredit you, make you look like a fraud. The timing is too perfect. Someone is orchestrating this. Min felt the walls closing in. He had always known that the forces behind the system were powerful. But this was beyond anything he had anticipated. They were not just trying to stop him. They were trying to ruin him completely. Min, gripping the edge of his desk, trying to maintain composure. I won't let them do this. We'll fight back. Gwen, you don't have to do this alone. We'll bring in the press, expose them for what they're doing. Min shook his head. The press, for all its power, was often as corrupt as the institutions he was trying to change. He couldn't rely on them. He needed something bigger, something that would force the system to listen. He needed to find a way to expose the corruption at the highest levels. And he would do whatever it took to make sure the truth came to light. A dangerous alliance. Min's fight was no longer just against the corrupt police officers or the elites he had been targeting. It was now a battle against a deeply entrenched system that would stop at nothing to preserve its power. As he navigated through this murky world, he realized that if he wanted to take down the people behind it all, he would need to form alliances with some unlikely figures. Individuals who operated in the shadows, who understood the darker side of the system he was fighting against. His meetings with these shadowy figures became more frequent, and though Min didn't trust all of them, he knew that without their help, he couldn't expose the full extent of the corruption. The price of playing in this world, however, was high. Every ally he made brought with it a risk. Would they betray him when it suited their own interests? But Min didn't have a choice. He had already come too far, and there was no turning back now. The world was changing around him, and he had no intention of being silenced. The final confrontation. As Min's fight against the corrupt system continued to escalate, the stakes grew higher. The deeper he dug, the more dangerous the forces arrayed against him became. His once small foundation had grown into a powerful symbol of defiance, and his efforts were starting to gain traction across the nation. People who had once been too afraid to speak out were now finding their voice, thanks to the courage Min had shown. But with this newfound power came a series of dangerous moves from those at the top. Min had started to notice strange things happening around him. His office was bugged, his phone was tapped, and his team began to receive threats. They were watching him closely, waiting for him to slip up. It was a game of cat and mouse, and Min had learned to stay one step ahead. But he knew the time was coming when it would no longer be about staying in the shadows. The final confrontation was approaching, a breakthrough in the investigation. One evening, Min was in his office with his trusted lawyer, Nguyen, going over a newly uncovered set of documents. These papers revealed a hidden connection between the most powerful figures in the country, a network of businessmen, politicians, and high-ranking officers who had been working together for decades to maintain their grip on power. Min had the proof he needed. It was irrefutable. Min, examining the documents, his voice steady but filled with intensity. "This is it, Nguyen. This is the breakthrough we've been waiting for. We have all the evidence we need to expose them." Nguyen nodding, though concern was evident in his eyes. "This could bring them down, Min. But you have to understand, once we release this, there's no turning back. They will come for you in ways you can't even imagine." Min, looking resolute. "I know, but we've already lost too much. Too many lives have been ruined by these people. I can't let it go any longer." The decision was made. Min couldn't afford to wait. He had to act now, before those in power had a chance to destroy the evidence or silence him permanently. The public reveal. The following day, Min and his legal team coordinated a press conference that would shake the country to its core. It was carefully planned, with every detail mapped out. Min knew that this was his only chance to expose the full scale of the corruption and hold those responsible accountable. The room was filled with journalists, activists, and officials. As Min stepped up to the podium, the buzz of anticipation in the air was palpable. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was no longer just a legal battle. It was a fight for the future of the country. Min, addressing the press, his voice unwavering. "Today, I stand before you not as a victim of a corrupt system, but as a voice for the millions who have been silenced for far too long. What I am about to reveal is not just the story of one wrongful arrest. It is the story of a nation held hostage by a small group of elites, people who have exploited their power and their positions to rob the people of their rights and dignity. We have uncovered irrefutable evidence linking high-ranking officials, businessmen, and law enforcement officers to a widespread network of corruption. This network has plagued our justice system for decades, and it is time for it to end." The room fell silent as Min presented the evidence. Photographs, financial records, covert recordings, all pointing to the key figures in the scandal. His heart pounded in his chest as he saw the reactions of those in the room. Some faces turned pale, while others seemed to be on the edge of panic. Min knew that the true power of this revelation wasn't just in evidence. It was in the fact that he was daring to speak the truth so boldly. As the press conference continued, the reactions were immediate. News outlets began airing the story nationwide, and within hours, calls for investigations and protests erupted in cities across the country. The people were finally waking up to the reality of the corruption that had infected their institutions. Men had given them the courage to stand up and demand change. The backlash. But Min was far from naive. He knew that releasing such explosive information would come with consequences. Almost immediately, the backlash began. The government, desperate to protect its interests, launched a smear campaign to discredit Min. Media outlets that had once supported his cause turned against him, accusing him of being a puppet for opposition forces. His personal life was dragged through the mud, and false allegations were spread about his character and motivations. Despite the onslaught of attacks, Min remained steadfast. The truth was out there now, and he wouldn't let anyone silence him. The darkest hour. Then came the darkest moment of all. Late one night, Min was at home when he received a phone call from his assistant. His foundation's offices had been raided. Files were destroyed, computers were wiped clean, and critical evidence was lost. Min, on the phone, voice shaking with anger. Who did this? Who's behind this? Assistant, voice filled with panic. They knew exactly where to go, Min. We tried to stop them, but it was too late. The evidence we had, it's gone. Min's mind raced. He had expected this, but to lose everything so quickly was a devastating blow. He knew that this was more than just a setback. It was a direct attempt to erase the truth and stop him from continuing the fight. But even in this moment of despair, Min refused to back down. He had come too far, and he wasn't going to let them win now. The turning point. As the days passed, men grew more determined. The loss of critical evidence was a hard blow, but it didn't mean the end of the fight. His team rallied around him, and they found new ways to push forward. The support of the public, which had grown in strength, was now more important than ever. In the midst of the turmoil, Min's lawyers discovered a crucial piece of evidence that had been overlooked. A whistleblower within the government who had kept a record of all communications related to the corruption network. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the pressure on. The final push, the government's attempts to silence Min, only seemed to make his resolve stronger. He continued to speak out, refusing to be intimidated. As his story gained international attention, the pressure on the government to act grew unbearable. Min's courage became a symbol of resistance, inspiring countless others to join the fight for justice. Then one fateful day, the system began to crack. High-ranking officials were arrested, and investigations into the corruption network finally gained traction. The tide was turning, but even as victory seemed within reach, Min knew that this was only the beginning. The battle against corruption was far from over, and the forces aligned against him were not easily defeated. He had taken a stand, and now he had to see it through to the end. And so, as he stood in front of the crowd at a major rally for justice, Min knew that the struggle for truth, accountability, and reform was a long one. But it was one he was ready to continue fighting, no matter what the cost. The road ahead was uncertain, but as long as there was a chance to make a difference, he would keep moving forward. Because, in the end, the fight for justice was worth everything.